have the video later.
Start. Okay, welcome to this Countryside COP event, online event. So all this week is Countryside COP. Now, Countryside COP is sort of intended as a platform to bring people together to talk about how land and agriculture can help move us towards the objectives of the United Nations framework on climate change. And obviously, we're approaching COP 28, which is going to be held in United Arab Emirates, and a significant element apparently of that. Sorry, I'm just going to be continuing to admit people as we go along. A significant element of COP28 this year is actually going to be the food system, agriculture and the food system. So this week we are going to be holding a lot of these Countryside COP events across the UK, organised by Championing the Farmed Environment. And you're joining us here for one of these events, one of the first events this week, which is going to be this one led by us at the Allerton Project. And the title of that is Decarbonising from the Field Up. Now, my name is Joe Stanley. I am head of Sustainable Farming and Knowledge Exchange at the Allerton Project. And for those of you who don't know, the Allerton Project is a research and demonstration farm on the Leicestershire-Rutland border. So for 30 years, we've essentially been trying to demonstrate how modern, productive and hopefully profitable food production can coexist alongside a thriving natural environment. And please do check out our website or our social media streams to sort of see some of the work that we are up to. So my background is personally as a farmer. So I'm a sort of dairy, arable and beef farmer before I came to the Allerton Project, and personally come from a very conservative sort of traditional farming background. So I can sort of approach the sort of innovative stuff that we're doing at the Allerton Project from that viewpoint. It's been really interesting to learn about some of the more innovative practices that are currently being sort of championed by leaders within the industry. We are demonstrating today, as part of this Countryside COP event, the Climate Neutral Farms project. And that is something that the Allerton Project is involved with, alongside the other speakers that we have here today. Climate Neutral Farms, in brief, is a European Union Horizon 2020 project with the intention of helping to decarbonise agricultural production across the European Union and the UK. And the Allerton Project is leading alongside Nestle one of those projects here in the UK, which is around decarbonising the supply of wheat and cereals, which, significantly, of course, are a significant part of the UK agricultural economy. 2/3 of the emissions from wheat production, for example, is thought to come from the application of fertilisers. And of course, the vast majority of the remainder of the carbon footprint is coming from fuel. So we need to look at how we can address those emissions as part of wheat production if we're going to achieve our industry's ambition of reaching net zero by 2040, and of course our wider societal target of hitting net zero by 2050. Of course, agriculture itself in the UK contributes around about 10% of emissions to the UK emissions inventory. So we do have a responsibility to take a lead in trying to decarbonise our emissions where we can as farmers. So without further ado, I am going to now introduce our other speakers and then allow them to introduce themselves. I think if we allow them to introduce themselves, I'm not entirely sure how technology is working here, I'm not going to lie, but I presume people can raise a hand and potentially ask a question in the chat, which might be the best way of going about things, and then I'll field those questions as we go along, and I'll also be acting as chair for the event, so I'll have my own questions in hand as well. So perhaps if people could ask questions in the chat, that would be the easiest way to go about things. So without further ado, I'll first of all introduce our three speakers. So we have Henry Reynolds, who is a mixed farmer from Northamptonshire. We've got Martin Lyons, who is an arable farmer from Cambridgeshire, and Matt Ryan, who is head of regeneration at Nestle UK and Ireland. So if I could perhaps start with Henry. Henry, if you could sort of give yourself a bit more of an introduction and also suggest for you, what is your motivation for trying to reach net zero, if you, of course, even are trying to reach net zero?
Thanks, Joe. So as Joe said, my name's Henry Reynolds. I'm a farmer from Northamptonshire. Father and I farm about 200 hectares, most of which is arable, but we have 90 breeding ewes as well. We have a bit of a foot in several camps. We're part owned, part rented. We rent about 80 of those hectares. And we've been charting really a regenerative course in agriculture for the last 20 years without having had that label, I suppose, until fairly recently. This is our 21st season of min-till. And then we've been converting in more recent years, as and when we feel conditions are suitable, to no-till. And frankly, the initial driver for that conversion to min-till was not really anything to do with net zero. Back 20 years ago, we weren't thinking of that. It was more the case that we got some people retiring on the farm. We weren't going to have the labour that we had. And it made sense to look at a slightly different way of doing things that would get more work done in a shorter amount of time. But as we've gone on, we've learned that our inputs using this system are significantly lower. So we've saved huge amounts of diesel, an awful lot of wearing metal, and we have fewer people working for us, which, at least in terms of cost of production, is very valuable. There are maybe societal impacts there that aren't so great, but and then in more recent years, we come to realise that this journey is part of farm resilience. So net zero and the prospect of wider impact, we see climate change happening around us every day. I mean, it's abundantly clear that we've got some problems with the weather being as it has been this last month, but that's happening to us as farmers every day. We see our I was going to say we're operating at the coal face, but that's perhaps not quite the right terminology. But as the people operating on this factory floor, which gets rearranged for us virtually every day we go out, I think we've come to realise that aiming for net zero is not just important for the environment, it's very important for our own resilience, with spiralling input costs, all of those related to energy, and recognising that the foundation of the system that we were using before was all on finite resources, and those things are dwindling. So we need an alternative, and that's really our motivation for exploring this sort of way of thinking.
Thanks, Henry. Martin, would you like to answer the same question and introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, good morning and thank you. So we're predominantly an arable farm currently, reintroducing livestock, but we've gone in, I think, a full circle. 25 years ago, we were a mixed farm. The livestock left, we intensified the cropping system. We had some stewardship schemes going on, but there suddenly become a focus that the additional spend we're spending on pesticides to tackle the problems we're having around blackgrass was not working. The costs and the profitability of the business was struggling. So we went down a road of reducing cultivations, changing rotations, and trying to fix our problems through a systems approach rather than a product approach. And that journey went on, and still goes on, particularly the last 10 years. But through that, we've been having stewardship on the farm, and we've been seeing the benefits of that. And it got me along a journey of actually thinking about soil health and the biodiversity benefits in our landscape and the worms. And that really had changed my mindset in how do I fix the problem that we grow our food from, is our soil. And if I can improve our soil health, that improves my costs, the resilience in our business. So for the last 10 years, we've reduced cultivations, shallow cultivations, and then sort of focused on removing cultivations and putting cover crops in, adding livestock. We had a visiting shepherd and his sheep to build fertility and convert the green matter into readily available nutrients. We're looking to bring cattle into the system. We've added herbal lays into the farm. But through that journey, we often hear it called out regenerative and net zero. For me, it was focusing about making my business resilient, making my soil health more resilient to high rainfalls and droughts. We're on 65% clay. It can be really challenging, but we have seen really good progress in our soil health over the last 5 or 6 years and see change happen. And for me, I hadn't really seen it until my agronomist and other people visited the farm and said, our soil is different to other people's locally. And that's what we normalize what we see. And for me, to get to net zero is an opportunity, one, to take responsibility of my own carbon footprint. And we know every business is going to have to reduce its carbon footprint. But if we can do it earlier, is there any business opportunity in marketing products, marketing carbon, being in that forefront? Because if everybody else is doing it in the years to come, where is the business margin? So for me, it's been about recording, measuring, reducing, and really focusing on removing fossil fuel-based products as much as possible. And I'll explain a bit more later, but we've had some really good success, but I do need support, information, research to really help me understand how much nitrogen's in the soil, how much nutrients is my cover crop capturing, how much can I step back with staying profitable and productive without having huge impacts on my business, particularly while we're going through a transition through farming payments, and how do we stack those enterprises? But yeah, so the focus, I worry about labels, but the focus for me is making a resilient business, delivering solutions that our supply chain and my business needs for the future.
Thanks, Martin. If you are looking to get some cattle, I can definitely recommend Longhorns. You'll need some strong fences though, but I can source some of those for you. Thank you, Matt. So coming at it from a different point of view, so from the supply chain, because yeah, it's important that organizations such as yourselves are of course involved in these conversations, because farmers cannot operate in isolation from the rest of the food system. So it'd be great if you could again introduce yourself and talk around what Nestle's motivation for this journey is, and how that fits in with the farm gate.
Sure, thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm Matt Ryan. I'm regeneration lead at Nestle UK and Ireland. We're quite a big business, so it's spread across about 190 countries around the world. Biggest food and beverage business globally, and specifically to the UK and Ireland market. We have 8,000 staff. We have 14 factories just in the UK. So despite our small geographic size as an island, or a collection of islands, we're the third largest market for Nestle globally, behind the US and China. So very important market for the business in general. Our supply chain in the UK and Ireland is very much focused around dairy and arable. So we've got a big fresh milk supply coming out of southwest Scotland and Cumbria for our coffee and confectionery businesses. But a lot of the focus of today and the discussions that we've been having with the Allerton team around the Climate Neutral Farms project is more around the arable side of the supply chain. So predominantly wheat, but other cereals and obviously sugar as well forms an important part of our ingredient mix for some of our products as well. So that's more focused on the eastern side of the country, obviously. So just to give you a bit of context around the drivers, I think from our side is really important. And I think there's the tendency to think that pressure is being applied from above predominantly. So from our customers, which are the retailers, but also citizens, people expect businesses like us to be going the extra mile and not necessarily putting it on labels, but just expecting that it's happening and that we are looking to address climate-related risks, which is absolutely true. Also, pressure from investors is incredibly important and really focuses the mind of our executive team. So when top-down pressure is applied, it does really help. But fundamentally, I think anything we need to be considering the long-term future of our business in all of these discussions as well, and actually perfectly aligned with what Henry and Martin have already said. Resilience at the farm level is actually cascades directly to the resilience of our business as an organisation that's almost entirely dependent on agriculture. So from our global emissions footprint, which in 2018, which is our baseline year, was close to 90 million tonnes of carbon emissions per year. which I think is about a third of the UK's total greenhouse gas footprint. So it's an enormous footprint. About 70% of that is related to how and where we source our ingredients. So about 65 million tons of carbon emissions within our supply chain comes from sourcing. So fundamentally, if we're to stand any chance of getting close to net zero, scope 3, so our indirect emissions from how we're sourcing our ingredients is going to be fundamental to that. It's also perhaps the most challenging as well, because we need to be working in close partnership with our partners in the supply chain and with farmers to help to deliver those sorts of outcomes. And while we are making really good progress on that and on reducing our manufacturing emissions, certainly the biggest efforts that we have at the moment are looking at what we can be doing within our global supply chain. And that's why I think the efforts that we're making with the Clean Farms project and with other projects in the UK are just so important for us, because it'll help not only ourselves to reduce our footprint, but hopefully the likes of Henry and Martin as well, with some support from us.
Thanks, Matt. And perhaps later on we could sort of bring up the Lens network, the local Landscape Enterprise Network.
You've got it.
Yeah, Landscape Enterprise Network, which is, we're all looking for new ways to fund some of these climate-friendly practices, and I know Nestle's heavily involved with that. So some of that private money coming into the system, it'd be really worth covering that off. I'm a big fan of your Kit Kats as well. They are fantastic. Henry, could you kick us off with, you are one of our climate neutral farmers. We are looking today to try and cover some of the practical things that farmers can do on the ground today. We can look at stuff like, biochar applications or enhanced rock weathering, these sorts of things, but they're kind of almost future tech, really. What sort of practical things are you implementing at the farm level in order to, both reduce, hopefully, your emissions and to help Matt with those scope 3 emissions, which you're passing down the supply chain, but also to hopefully improve your business efficiency and profitability as well?
Well, some of the things, we started in a very dramatic way, I suppose, in that we got rid of the plough, we got rid of the power harrow, and we went cold turkey into a min-till system. We bought a new min-till cultivator and a drill that matched. I think it was quite important that we invested in a system that was consistent with itself. We didn't try to pick an element of this and pick an element of that. So thinking about how you can modify your system so it works together is fairly important. But it may not be that everybody has the ability just to convert instantly like that. And I'm not necessarily sure whether it's a sensible thing to do under all circumstances. But
so your approach was to go big or go home, essentially?
It was initially, but I think more recently we've found that there are ways we can tweak and modify the system without having to go big or go home. So for instance, we've reduced the draft of the drill by changing from the original, it's a horse drill, we've gone from the original duet coulters that it had down to Dutch openers, which in part we've been able to do because the soil conditions are now suitable for doing that. But overnight, that simple change, it hasn't really altered any of the way we do anything else, but what it's done is it saved us 6 litres per hectare of fuel on drilling. And so there are sometimes things that you can implement like that, which are a marginal adaptation of the system that you're using. You're not doing a sort of cold turkey type thing, but you can actually make quite a significant change. And likewise, adding in cover crops, getting the local farmer who's got some sheep to come and graze those cover crops, perhaps. They're incremental changes that you don't need to go out and buy your own flock of sheep. You can perhaps get the neighbour who has a no-till drill to come and do a little bit for you and see how it goes, but make sure the conditions are right for doing that operation. Otherwise, you're likely to end up with a result that tells you you absolutely shouldn't be doing this. But there are plenty of people around who are part way along or very far along this journey who can perhaps do a little bit of work, help you develop a system before you have to make that sort of huge change that we did 21 seasons ago.
Well, I think that's a really good point. I mean, so and before I just hand over to Martin to ask him the same question, we've been conducting a long-term direct drill trial at the Allerton Project with Syngenta, and as you say, all we've changed in our normal arable rotation is essentially the establishment method, and that has demonstrated that purely by switching from a plough-based system to a direct drill system, we have essentially, yes, we've halved our fuel usage, which of course has a carbon impact in and of itself. Although on our heavy clay soils, our overall yield has decreased by around 8%. Actually, our profitability per hectare has increased by 15% over that 5-year rotation, over the whole rotation. So yeah, just by changing one thing, leaving everything else the same, I think our overall per ton of production carbon footprint has decreased by about 10%. And like I say, that's not making, we're not stopping growing arable crops, we're not planting trees, we're just changing one element of that system. But you also make a really good point in terms of making sure that you give things a fair chance, because if you go out onto the Allerton Project estate at the moment, you'll see that unfortunately pretty much the only winter wheat which has survived is that in our plough plots. Whereas unfortunately the stuff that was direct drilled just before the 2 named storms that came through has all been drowned out on our heavy clay soils. So, but you're absolutely right, that is an extreme situation in one particular year, and we can't say that means that all direct drilling, for example, is therefore hopeless. We do definitely have to, but of course it also adds that much wider thing of, in terms of farms have to be profitable in order to invest in in this sort of green transition. So if a farmer's looking at our results this year, they'll say, well, in these conditions we should be ploughing, and it's actually very difficult to make the argument against that, because of course the carbon impact of having direct drilled 100 hectares of winter wheat which subsequently failed is much worse than having ploughed and drilled. So yeah, we're in a rock and a hard place, aren't we, on this sort of issue.
I think just picking up on the point about things going wrong. I mean, we did early on have some problems, years 3 to 5. Min-till, it takes a while for the soil to adapt to a new system, and our yields dropped off. We're now growing well into this system. We're growing yields that are every bit as good as they ever were before, and in some years considerably better. So it's come back and adapted, but I think, I mean, we'll probably come on to this later, but amongst these practical steps, you do need some expectation management and an understanding of the implications of doing some of the stuff that you're going to do and the effects it might have, and just be aware that there are implications to doing these things, and you may have the odd bad year, but overall, hopefully you're going to smooth out some of those peaks and troughs.
Thanks, Henry. Martin, over to you. What sort of measures are you implementing on your farm, and how have they been playing out?
Yeah, thank you. So I focused around mainly fuel, fertilizer, and data. So we looked at our fuel use, and we literally start with the combine. Can we lift? If I've got a drill that can handle longer stubbles, if I lift the header up, I significantly reduce the amount of straw going through the chopper, so I can save fuel there. So we end up with longer stubbles. Am I selling it early, and what's the penalty for how dry it will be? So I quite often get a harvest 15, half, even up to 16%, as long as I'm marketing that in the first few months. We avoid, well, we've actually removed our dryer now. It stops me the temptation of cutting it too wet. That's gone. We do have a capacity through a cooperative if we really need to capture milling wheats at a premium. But how do we reduce that fuel use? And then it's around soil health and take field by field management. It's hard because you can't just do a blanket approach, but we have some fields in the early years that really are adaptable to moving almost straight into a direct drill system. We had some other fields, quite frankly, they're only just getting there now, And you've got to be patient with them. And we all know we've got different fields and they take different management. To go whole hog 100% of the farm would cause me big problems when I started, but we took the field by field approach. The first piece of metal that would enter a field up post-harvest would be my spade. I'd seen through the year where there was difference in crop health, yield impacts. What is the difference? What's it telling me? Have I got compaction? Is there a weed issue? And then I started looking around data. What does the yield data say? What's biomass data? If I'm building fertility up into the soil through cover crops and some grazing, and if I'm able to bring in manures or organic material, what has my crop got? So I started looking at, well, I've got to focus on in the next 3 years left. I had a 5-year target to remove fossil fuel-based fertilizer off the farm. Can I do it? What do I need to do? So for me, I do soil testing in the spring. How much nitrogen's in the soil profile? Where is it? So if it's deep, those roots are going to take a time to access it. If it's shallow, they'll be readily available. We do tissue analysis through the spring. What's the crop telling me? It may look pale because I think it's hungry, but what we've found, it's zinc, boron, or manganese or trace elements, not nitrogen that's been short of. And then we can do satellite biomass imagery coming over and stack that data sheets up to give me the confidence to say, actually, on half our winter wheat the year before last, had no artificial nitrogen at all. There's between 180 and 260 kilos available in our soil. But if I use that in 1 year's crop, I know the following year, I've actually sucked a lot of the availability out. So I have to make adjustments to the rotation. And so that's where we've gone down to a field by field, backing up by data and really kind of concentrating and building fertility up through cover crops, through fallows, through lays, anything else I can. Bring clover as an understory, understore the wheat in the wheat. But I need the data to back up the evidence to say, what benefit is that they're now doing to my crop? I know it looks lovely. I'm really proud I've got a lovely white clover understory in the wheat, but is that building fertility or is it not? So it's about having the data to give me the confidence to say, actually, I can cut fertilizer back by 20, 30, 50% this season because the results will show for me rather than just taking guesses. And I think that's the approach I've gone, is trying to back up the evidence in the trials I do. And we've broken the fields down. I've got flower strips in the middle of the fields every 120 meters, and we can do different trials or blocks to say that tram line, I'm going to cut it by 100%, and let's see what the impact is. Let's ground truth what I see by evidence on my field in a tram line, and every application we put on, whether that's a pesticide or a fertilizer, I'll always miss a piece. Sometimes I'm bold and I miss a lot because I need to evidence myself what the difference makes. And that's, for me, it's ground truth in what I think I can do with what the data says and what's the action on the ground.
I think that's really interesting, Martin, and sort of I think what's great that both you and Henry have already mentioned is actually some yes, we've got strategic things that we can do as an industry. We can talk about the decarbonisation of fertilizer manufacture, right, using green hydrogen, but actually on the farm level, Henry, you're talking about using different drill points in order to achieve fuel savings, and Martin, you're talking about when do we actually go out there and combine, and AHDB and Yen Zero, the ADAS Yen Zero project, have got some really interesting data around both the cost and the carbon implications of drying grain from 20 down to 15% versus 16 down to 15%, or not drying it at all. And we don't really consider those to be a significant factor, but it's that, as you said, I think, Martin, those marginal gains around how can we put lots of little things together in order to help to reduce not only our carbon intensity, but also more prosaically our on-farm costs. And that's really interesting. I'd like to come back to the rotation issue with you later on, if I could, Martin, and Henry as well. But Matt, just on if there's anything you'd like to add on what the previous two have said, but I'd actually potentially like to come to you on the data issue as well, because the data thing, I imagine from Nestle's viewpoint, is really important. We need to make sure that we are utilizing the best data available and that we are actually setting targets which are, I guess, achievable. And I wonder if you have a position on that, because as you say, 70% of your company's footprint comes from the supply, comes from farmers, comes from the commodities you're bringing in. So that must be a really important element for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I get onto that, I'll just to complete the circle, I guess, and talk a little bit about some of the other non-ag decarbonisation things that we're working on. And just actually, Joe, you prompted me to say this by mentioning your affinity for a Kit Kat. And one of the things you probably noticed as an avid Kit Kat eater yourself is that we've taken the foil out of the Kit Kat, which is actually, not the most popular among some of the avid fans, but certainly the generated CO2 savings just from taking the foil out of a Kit Kat is thousands of tons per year. And so a lot of the time we are looking at sort of minor tweaks like that, or changes in packaging to actually generate really significant savings across the business as well. There's we're looking at cleaner logistics as well, so fuel efficiency, more fuel efficient vehicles, alternative transport methods, so rail, using shipping more where we can. There's lots of other things that we're doing in terms of our manufacturing as well. So obviously increasing the use of renewable energy, but looking to switch off combined heat and power plants where it makes sense. So in our York facility, that will be switched off in the next year or so, which will deliver a huge CO2 saving for the manufacturing sites as well. But going back to the sourcing side of things, and above all else, sourcing our ingredients in a sustainable and low carbon ways is definitely the most important thing that we can do. And we've got a couple of different projects that have been in the media recently. So one was around this cocoa shell fertilizer, which is again it's a trial at the moment to see what we can do to look at the waste products that are coming out the back end of our factory and see what we can be doing to take advantage of the nutritional qualities that they might have as well, and create a fertilizer which could be circled back onto farms in the UK as well. As I've said, with 14 factories in the UK and Ireland, each of those will have a waste stream that we're obviously trying to do something with. So if there is something that we could do to provide that back in terms of a low carbon fertilizer to the likes of Henry and Martin. And Martin, you've mentioned as well that you're looking to remove your fossil fuel based fertilizers from your farm in the short term as well. So that's obviously hugely important to us as well. So looking to those sorts of options is really interesting for us, in addition to looking at things like biochar, as you mentioned, and enhanced rock weathering. So all of these things are being looked at by our central R&D teams as well. But really, we're trying to get as much information on a few of these approaches as we possibly can. Just in terms of practical things that we're doing at scale at the moment. So I mentioned at the start of my talk that we're working primarily in dairy and arable in the UK, but we've got a long-standing partnership with our fresh milk suppliers, First Milk, and we're looking at a long-term regenerative agriculture transition plan with them, which is very much focused on more animals outside, diverse pastures, mob grazing, as much as we can across that 10 or 11,000 hectares of dairy sourcing that we have. And again, seeing some really interesting results from that at the moment. It's going to get more ambitious, I think, in the next few years as well. So it'll be interesting to see. And once we go back with our soil carbon partners, AgriCarbon, to collect the follow-up samples, I think that will be really interesting to see how much change we've seen in those farms. And then that just touches on your point, Joe, around data and the importance of rigor and accuracy, particularly when it comes to soil carbon, which I'm sure a lot of people on this call will appreciate is a little bit unclear at the moment in terms of what sort of level of accuracy all of this we're going to need to see. And I think from our perspective, having a reliable baseline is fundamentally the most important thing you can do at the moment. So we've done some work with a number of different providers, and we've seen just how variable some of the results can be. So all I'll say at the moment is that nothing beats a spade, getting out there and taking some samples and really making sure you're as confident with those results as you possibly can, because there is the chance that you go back in 5 years or whenever you want to resample those fields and see that you actually can't really detect that much change, because there's too much uncertainty in your initial measurements. So we've been working quite extensively with a company called AgriCarbon to get as many samples from across our supply chain as we possibly can. So on fresh milk, I think we've looked at most, if not all, of the farms at the moment with their approach, and we're starting to roll that out within the arable side of things as well, just to really understand what's there, where we're starting from, and what we can do to build on that to support the likes of Henry and Martin as well. Very quickly as well, the other big project that we have, which I believe Henry and possibly Martin as well are involved in, is the Lens project, which Joe mentioned earlier, which is really it's a collaborative project, which is trying to get as many different businesses from across your rotations to link in together to provide farmers with a single coherent ask, rather than you being approached by 10, 15 different customers of yours for slightly different things that might be similar, but with slightly different asks. Lens is a project which is really trying to consolidate that into a single ask to make it as simple as possible for us to have an impact, but most of all for you guys to understand what sort of direction the private sector is wanting to take you in, and how to receive funding for certain practices that you're looking to implement. So we've had some good success with that to date, and we've got some new partners coming on for 2024 as well, and we're really hoping to expand that out to get as many different businesses that are benefiting from your rotations as we possibly can.
Because the concept of that, Matt, is essentially that there's a pot of money and farmers can bid to put in their own proposals for what they can do on their land in order to improve biodiversity, reduce carbon, etc., improve water quality potentially. That's the concept of the Lens program.
Yeah, it's not prescriptive at all, and what we're trying to do is give some guidance around the sorts of practices and the sorts of outcomes that the partners are looking for. But it really is over to the farmers that are participating to come to us with solutions. And yes, of course, we're funding cover crops and no-till and all of this stuff. But some of the more interesting proposals, or a lot of the more interesting proposals that we're getting, are actually the blank page in the guidance, where we actually say, well, come to us with some ideas. Come to us with an idea to set up a cluster, to run some trials, and they're the most impactful things. And then if we're able to share what those farmers or those groups of farmers have presented and the outcomes that they've got across the whole network, then we start to get some really interesting outcomes for everyone.
Thanks, Matt. I'm not sure how I feel about being described as an avid Kit Kat eater. They say the camera adds £20, but Henry, just to return to, we were going to cover hopefully a bit around rotations. Now, this is obviously something which is relatively simple. And Henry and Martin, please just chip in whichever of you has views on this. What have you done with your rotations compared to where you were a decade ago, which, among other benefits, has reduced your carbon intensity on farm? And how has that sat commercially? Obviously, in an ideal world, we'd all be growing wheat, all the time. But how has your changes you may have made to your rotations, have they benefited the farm on that environmental side? But then how have you squared that commercially?
I think, Joe, I'd take you back 20 years or more, when we were doing what most people around here were doing, 2 wheats and a rape. And it was simple and straightforward. I suppose it was relatively profitable, but we were building up problems for ourselves, and moving into min-till with that sort of system, we were building up slug numbers, and more especially, we were building up blackgrass. And the blackgrass forced a re-evaluation of how we do rotations, and we went to a very heavy spring cropping of barley in order to be able to get some control on the blackgrass and to compete it out. And then subsequently, we've done a reasonable job of cleaning up the farm on the blackgrass side, and we've been able then to go into a much more diverse rotation. And I think we've learnt our lesson that essentially putting all our eggs in that fairly simplistic basket was not a very good idea. So Now we have spring cropping in the rotation to allow us to clean up the black grass. We put in cover crops as a lead into that spring crop, and we're just investigating whether we might get more benefit from those by keeping those in longer rather than just pulling them out after a winter. We've put beans in for their good soil conditioning and, of course, adding some nutrition back in. We've just introduced some spring oats as a break crop because we have found in recent years that oilseed rape is just not doing it for us anymore for obvious reasons. And I think what we've really learned is that from a business side, if we're talking about resilience, we need that diversity in our rotation. So we haven't this year. Father was at a meeting the other day where there were 40 farmers there, and the question was asked, how many have drilled 60% of done 60% of their winter drilling? And only Father and 3 others put their hands up. Well, this is what the weather and the climate is throwing at us these days. So if we had all our eggs in the winter basket, that would be a problem. Likewise, it might be a problem if we had them all in the spring basket, where in the last few years we've had these sort of droughts after we've done our spring cropping. Likewise, if we've got some barley and some wheat and some oats and some beans, there are more things. One of them is hopefully going to do well for us. So I think that's where we've come at it from. We've learned our lessons on the being too specialist. It's given us some problems that we've had to overcome, but it's driven us along this line of diversity, which we're now learning is really very good from a business resilience point of view.
Thanks, Henry. Martin, have you got anything to add to that on sort of the value of diverse rotations?
Yeah, very similar journey. We simplified and had some very good years of very simple rotation, but by heck, it cost us through black grass and other problems and soil health problems. And what we've found is that resilience in diverse rotations, mixing wheats together. We mix a million wheats together. We're starting bringing heritage wheats back in, seeing what that can offer. If I'm doing on heritage wheats with no input, 6.5 tonne a hectare, well, that's quite a good return for very little risk. And that's what I'm now trying to de-risk the business, but also looking at, in England, we've got the SFI, is how much of that could I lock in into herbal lays or other things to give me a fertility build period? Then I need to have livestock to graze that. And does that build resilience in? But it does build complications in. You've got to have more headspace and management time to think about each individual crop. And I work closely with my agronomist because he's my eyes on the ground, and we can use the data to point to where the problems are. But it needs to be a team effort, because the simple system we had 15 years ago was easy. Now we really need that thinking time, the managerial time, the time to get out and check and walk crops, but have the resilience that, as in this year, winter wheat isn't planted. I've got lots of untreated. We clean our seed. We don't put treatment on it. I feel I don't need it. So what I haven't used will go back on the heap, and I'll go out to my spring heaps of barley and some oats and pull a bit off there. So I've got no cost tied up of seed stuck in the shed. So that builds up resilience into that as well. So we haven't got huge checks having to be written out when that climate weather changes, and it's having some early drilled, late drilled autumn stuff, some early spring, some late spring. One will always have a problem, but 3 hopefully will go on over the line and give us a return.
And it's important, isn't it, to kind of make that distinction almost in the world we're now existing. As you say, production payments are long gone. And now in the world of SFI, we need to be concentrating more. I think the Allerton Project would suggest on the gross, not on the gross output of the system anymore, but on the fundamental productivity across a whole different range of income streams. They're land-based businesses almost now, more than food production businesses. And yeah, as you say, your heritage wheats, 6.5 tonnes to the hectare, but with very low input costs, is potentially more profitable than trying to have a high input, high output system with the associated associated carbon footprint, and exactly as you say, those exposure to extreme volatility of costs, especially around things like fertilizer. So that's yeah, it's a much bigger picture, isn't it, than just saying, you know, we need to move to net zero just because of climate targets. It's this whole business resilience picture, which this journey hopefully does feed into.
I look at our rotation now as a whole and the profitability of the whole, not an individual. We have some crops, particularly winter beans, that aren't over profitable some years, but they do huge amounts to soil health, weed management, fertility thing. And then how do I stack everything else around the cropping and my overhead costs, machinery costs? So we look at the business as a whole, and I'm trying to plan 7 and 10 years down, sort of along the line, not which winter wheat will give me the most margin this year. It's what can give us the best return for all the things we can deliver, and the difference, whether it's a commodity market, a public good, or a private finance thing, which can give us the resilience in the business.
And that presumably includes as well things like, you know, countryside stewardship schemes where you can, you know, utilize each hectare potentially to its best benefit. But of course, we have to recognize the challenges in not potentially focusing on this year's wheat yield, especially for, you know, those in the short-term tenanted sector, of course, where that sort of offers a whole different layer of challenge, and that is something that we do have to appreciate. And Matt, perhaps at that point to sort of hand over to you, how do you feel from, if you like, from the farmer's point of view, the more supply chain side of things, how do you feel that farmers can be best supported to make these changes, which, you know, we need to see as a society, farm businesses need to see, you guys need to see, but of course, potentially the economic imperative is not there to get all farmers on this pathway?
Yeah, and again, I think fundamentally, you know, we know that SFI is here now, and what we want to try and make sure is that, you know, we're able to find a way of coherently stacking the government's funding together with private sector funding as well. And I think there's still a little bit of uncertainty. Well, certainly some uncertainty on my side, and I'm guessing that probably means certainty from your side as well as to how that might take place. And one thing that I think we're in a bit of a transition towards at the moment is, and I don't think we're necessarily there at the moment, because we still believe that there is a need to be funding directly for payments for practices at the moment, just to ensure that there is some de-risking of taking up these types of practices being made available. But I think eventually, as the market starts to mature and there's more understanding of the value of these ecosystem services, it may be that there is more of a push to go towards an outcome-based payment for these types of things. However, I personally worry that puts all of the risks onto the likes of yourselves to deliver those particular outcomes, whereas I think fundamentally what's needed at the moment is financial support and skills and knowledge to really try to make this transition as quickly as we possibly can, and at as little as a cost to yourselves as possible.
Thanks, Matt. Could I move us on now to sort of, if you like, the other side of this this subject, which we haven't covered yet, which is the sequestration side of things. So we've talked about, obviously, net zero is essentially about two things when it comes to farms. You know, it's about both reducing emissions and potentially about locking up atmospheric carbon in biomass, in soils. Just to sort of throw it out there more generally, what role do you guys see that playing, the sequestration side of things playing, both practically for your respective businesses, but also in terms of the finances potentially around either, Matt, potentially offsetting or insetting into the supply chain, but Henry and Martin around the potential sale of carbon, and is that something you guys have looked into?
I just say I got excited a few years ago about selling carbon. I thought our farming practice, putting cover crops in, having grazing, you know, building organic matter, there's huge opportunity of that. So we mapped every part of every field almost. Instead of one sample per field, we zoned all the fields out to the different soil types. that opened my eyes to how much variability we have within a field. I could go and test one bit and it'd be amazing results. I haven't got to go very far across the field and it's a very different result. But also, as we look at if the supply chain wants me to, wants to reward me to inset the carbon to help them in balancing their sheets, if I've sold all my carbon, what have I got to offer the supply chain in insetting terms? So I stepped back and said, hang on, let's have a bigger picture of this. Let's focus on reducing my own footprint. And if we're going to market carbon, I need to be sub-zero, that's my focus, is being sub-zero, to then I have spare carbon that I can get rewards from supply chains and others. And focusing on sub-zero is a very different mindset, because that's actually got to have significant changes if we're going to help be rewarded by others in the supply chain. But we know many actions on the farm are having huge differences. But also the maps we created, I can see where we have crop impacts when dry weather comes directly relate to where my low carbon areas are within my soil. So there's a farm business benefit of stacking carbon into there, and if I'm bringing organic material in to crop resilience, but then also there's hopefully a place in the field I can increase carbon and market that through the supply chain and get early rewards while others are adapting their system.
But again, coming back to the importance of just in-field variability, data, the importance of data, that is something that we absolutely have to have. No, absolutely. Henry.
Well, I'd second everything Martin says. I mean, he's certainly further down the line than we are with this, but I very strongly hold the view that we will not sell and should not sell, and neither should anybody else, any carbon if you're not already net zero yourself. For one thing, it doesn't. If we take a global picture, speaking in a very sort of high-minded way, if I am not net zero and yet I'm selling you carbon because I've reduced some carbon from my operation, but I'm not yet net zero, then I'm giving license to somebody else, because by dint of them paying for it, to emit. So actually, overall, that doesn't reduce the emissions, and we have to reduce the emissions. So that's just a very sort of maybe a high-minded way of looking at it. But I think there is also a huge risk that Martin has outlined there, that if I go and sell all my carbon, what happens when in a few years' time, more is understood about this, and I might realise I need the carbon myself. I think measurement is extremely important. We have had a play with some of the carbon calculators, and it's obviously fairly easy to calculate the amount of carbon that you are purchasing when you're bringing stuff onto the farm, but calculating what is theoretically sequestered in soil by some practices is virtually impossible, I venture to say. And as an example of that, some of these calculators, they ask you, did you grow a cover crop? Well, yes, I grew a cover crop, which was 6 feet high, full of biomass, and all of that got reincorporated into the soil. My neighbour grew a cover crop that only made 3 inches high, but it still goes down on the calculator as a cover crop, and there is an amount of carbon that is associated with that. So there needs to be a lot more maturity in those systems before you can even consider, I think, trading on the basis of that. But there are some great bits of work being done on satellite imagery, ground truthing, all that sort of thing, that hopefully where we can actually measure what's happening in the soil, then that's where our opportunities might come from. I have a little bit of a concern on our farm that we've been reincorporating organic material for 40 years now. Since we got a straw chopper on the combine, we've not baled any and taken it away. And so actually the carbon levels here are quite high. But so my question is, how much further can we realistically go with that? We've already got 40 years of work done in this respect. And there are some theoretical, well, I imagine actually, if I say theoretical, I presume they're empirically proven that certain soils, like sand, cannot hold more than a certain amount of carbon. Well, if we're there already, we can't sequester it.
The curse of the early adopter when it comes to natural capital markets, Henry. You know, absolutely, that's a really good point. Matt, if you could cover off as well from Nestle's point of view, and then we'll sort of I'll ask each of you a short final question before we time out in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. I just want to echo what both Martin and Henry have said. I think it's a really interesting time. There's going to be huge opportunities, huge risks as well in engaging with these markets. But from personal experience, I can see how quickly the technology is developing in this space as well. So I don't think we're necessarily that far away from being able to quantify things much better than we are at the moment. So I think, you know, organizations like NASA are now getting involved in developments, R&D around soil carbon sequestration. There's a lot of work being done by a lot of organizations to try and square this. However, as you say, Martin, you know, we've seen through the work that we've done with AgriCarbon as well, just enormous variability in field and from field to field in the same soil types. Then you start to factor in different soil types, you know, how close you are to a watercourse, all of this. So I think, yeah, it's not going to be easy, but I think, you know, as I said, seeing how quickly everything is moving at the moment, yeah, I think we're going to see some developments quite soon. From a Nestle perspective, we've decided to not pursue any more carbon neutral claims for any of our brands from a few months ago on. So that actually means that there's no interest in the offset market from our side as well. All of the carbon reduction and removal, I guess, inventory that we're looking for to go towards our net zero roadmap will be coming directly from our supply chain and the landscapes that we're sourcing from as well. So I think that hopefully that, you know, gives a bit more reassurance that, you know, all of our focus is going to be on farms that are supplying into us, rather than, you know, investing in plantations or, you know, restoration in the highlands and stuff like this. So we want to be, you know, making sure that we're not just focusing on the carbon element, but fundamentally on ensuring we've got resilient farms within our supply chain as the first priority.
Thanks, Matt. And I think you mentioned NASA. I think they'll probably find that getting to the moon was a bit easier than getting accurate soil carbon stocks, but we will see. We'll leave them to it. Thank you all. A final question to all three of you, as close to a yes, no, or as you can get. Is net zero in, let's just say, agriculture more widely, is net zero achievable? Martin?
Yes, but I think that's the net is the appropriate. It should be sub-zero. We need to be offering service and benefits to others. They're looking to us, but I need to gain value by doing that through the supply chain or other ways.
Thank you. Henry?
I couldn't say it any better. I think it's achievable. I think we can do better. I believe the carbon calculators that we've used have sort of given that demonstration, at least, that it should be possible. So yeah, it's capitalizing on it is a different question.
We clearly should have got a farmer who was a climate change denier to add some spice to this. Matt, finally, from your perspective, let's talk from your perspective, and even more difficult, a wider food chain perspective. Is net zero possible?
Gosh, put me on the spot. No, I think I think it is, but again, I think it absolutely requires us to work in partnership as well. And I think, you know, what I was mentioning before around, you know, simple solutions to just repurpose nutrients that are coming from the waste streams of our factories, but also just addressing food waste fundamentally is going to be a critical thing that we need to try and do. 1.6 billion tons a year in the garbage bin. So I think fundamentally that's going to need to play a key role in getting us anywhere close to net zero.
Well, thank you very much all for your participation in this Countryside COP webinar. I hope everyone who joined us in real time had an informative time of it. And please feel free to share the link which will be made available subsequently to anyone else who might be of interest. But again, Martin, Henry, Matt, thank you very much for joining us today and for giving some really practical, useful guidance on this really difficult issue. Thank you very much all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.